So we've been talking about impact across a whole range of topics, from social impact to environmental. So now we're going to talk about something completely different, investment impact, or investing for impact. So why don't we, or impact investing, thank you very much. So we've got a very distinguished panelists. So why don't we get started and have you moderate?
Great. Well, thank you all for hanging out this late in the day. And you know, I just want to remind some of you who are not from Stanford and Silicon Valley that you're about 100 yards from where Fred Termans turned this school into an outward-facing university, probably one of the first in the country. And in doing so, he kickstarted entrepreneurship and innovation in Silicon Valley and helping this school commercialize exactly this topic, disruptive and emerging technologies, in the middle of the Cold War in the 1950s and 1960s. And one of the topics, or the topics of this panel, is about disruptive and emerging technologies and new business models. And I, just as a preamble to the panel, want to give you all an example of you know, disruptive and emerging technologies. We keep using that phrase, and it's kind of, sometimes you translate that to shiny gee whiz tech objects, and what does that mean? Is it that the latest AI or hardware or silicon or something? Let me give you a commercial example. Some of you are probably somewhat familiar with. Any of you heard of SpaceX at all? Yeah? SpaceX makes reusable rockets. And just by itself, SpaceX changed the math of how much it costs to put something in orbit. Because they reused the first stage, they're now up to reusing a first stage about 14 times. Think about what that does to math to competitors who are literally just throwing away rockets. So what? Well, the so what was the other point that most people missed when Elon Musk started that company. On top of SpaceX rockets, about 80% of them are launched carrying something called Starlink Satellites. Any of you familiar with Starlink? They basically provide broadband, very high-speed internet, almost anywhere in the world, via satellite with almost latency that is not only speed, but response time as good as commercial internet. Well, that was a business model that might have just obsoleted 2 or 3 or more companies. So when you're looking at disruptive and emerging tech, you also want to think about the companies and the investors looking past the horizon on those disruptive business models, not just the disruptive tech. And 2 of our panelists here are going to help us kind of understand those disruptive business models. You know, there's a line that was been used in Silicon Valley for a long time about future technologies that says, you know, the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. I think Alan Kay said that. But I think there's a better phrase that says the real insight might be the future is already here, but it's just not evenly monetized. And I think our panelists are going to give us some insights about that. So we have Sherwin Williams from AN Ventures, who's going to talk about dual use in space tech, and Lindsay Taylor talk about infrastructure from, I'm going to get the firm name wrong, Envirotech?
Envirotech.
All right, close. So why don't I let each of you for about 30 seconds describe yourself and your firm, and then we'll get into some questions. Why don't we start with you?
Yes, Sherman Williams. I'm managing partner for AIN Ventures. We are early stage investors. We invest at the early seed, pre-seed level into deep tech. We focus on space tech, like Steve said, sustainability tech, as well as health tech. And we really look at the intersection of dual use and deep tech. We have a separate initiative that I'm pretty passionate about also, where we invest in veteran-led startups. I'm a veteran myself. Dave Walsh, who spoke on Friday, he and I were classmates in Naval Academy. We were fellow intelligence officers for Naval Special Warfare. So that's me.
Lindsay?
Yeah, thank you. Pleasure to be here today. Lindsay Taylor, founder and CEO of a new fund called Envirotech, which invests at the intersection of infrastructure and technology with a focus on underserved and overlooked communities throughout the United States. As the genesis of how I got to launching this fund in the last few months, I spent many years in New York deploying billions of dollars into infrastructure assets, leading and executing those types of projects There's a tremendous need for infrastructure, which we'll talk about today. It's an extra special pleasure to be here today because I did my undergraduate here at Stanford, Science, Technology, and Society. Now really having the opportunity to truly deploy the things that I learned in school, as well as also on the soccer field, getting to win a national championship here as well.
Okay. Do we get to change your grade if you do well? Is that?
I don't know, we might want to go back and look at that.
So Lindsay, why don't we start with you? And maybe we'll just use some the beginnings of these conversations to start with some definition of terms. So when I think of infrastructure, I think of bridges and tunnels and highways and whatever. When you're using that term, and particularly for this audience, what do you mean by infrastructure and specifically the next generation of infrastructure?
Yeah, well, you got the first definition of infrastructure, right, which isn't always the thing that people think about in Silicon Valley. But yes, we're talking about physical infrastructure assets. But what the premise of our investment thesis is that, we're really at the precipice of the deployment of infrastructure assets in this country, and that as we think about the next generation of infrastructure, that infrastructure should be infused with technology so that we're able to better adapt with our cities, have more agile communities, and really be resilient in the future. So for us, we're investing in clean energy infrastructure, things like microgrids, EV charging, mobility infrastructure, so things like fleets, as well as digital payments, and then finally, broadband infrastructure, things like fiber as well as wireless.
Great. And I want to get back to that about how you intend to monetize that and
Sure.
Why invest in that. But thank you for that definition. And why don't we do the same? Sherman, explain to me this dual-use thing and why it's important.
So at its most basic level, dual-use technology is technologies that have both government and commercial application. And the underpinning / premise of our investment thesis is that the United States is in a strategic competition with potential adversaries who, we all know who those folks are, China, Russia, et cetera. And it is different from the Cold War arms race, fundamentally. And because it's a competition on multiple levels and mainly and heavily a technology competition. And the United States has to have a large amount of technology investment in order to maintain the lead. And as an example of that, you've seen in the last about 10 months, $1.5 trillion has been passed as far as legislation with the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS and Science Act, and then the climate provisions within the Inflation Reduction Act. That has been passed in the last 10 months, which I think shows how important this is to the United States. And two of those bills were bipartisan, by the way. And then also, with that level of money, it shows this is a fairly enduring theme because the competition is not going to stop. They are truly the forcing function. If the competition was not there, I think we would have a bit of an issue where technology would not be pushed as much.
Yeah, and I think, as we'll talk about later, this is one of the first times in a long time that the U.S. has gotten back at the national industrial policy at scale on multiple issues. But Lindsay, let's go back to you, and then we'll go back and forth. Help me understand why investing in infrastructure is important and what areas you kind of alluded to that.
Sure.
Why is it important?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you alluded to some of the tailwinds that really are behind the infrastructure asset class right now from the latest bills that have been passed that really enable for some of these newer types of infrastructure assets to truly be deployed, not only be deployed, but also be deployed into communities that have been overlooked in terms of a digital equity perspective. But as we think about deploying infrastructure and we think about what's happening in the United States today, we have a water crisis in Mississippi. We see bridges tumbling. We're seeing that climate change is very real. We're having to paint railroads white. We're seeing cracks in the cement. And we're seeing wildfires in California. I could go on and on. But infrastructure as an asset class, there's a tremendous need for deployment in dollars behind that. But then as you think and take a step back and think about the communities that aren't the communities that you naturally think about, like New York and Los Angeles and even San Francisco, there's an even larger need for those communities to really get infrastructure assets deployed. For example, there's 42 million Americans who don't have proper access to broadband. We've all been through the pandemic, unfortunately, for way too long. And in that time period, we've seen that those who have access to the internet versus those who don't, it has a tangible impact on one's life. A kid can't do their schoolwork or you can't do your work from home. So how do we truly get to those communities and get to those communities in a way that we're actually deploying infrastructure assets? So at ENVRA, our belief is that we're really trying to bridge venture capital as well as the deployment of asset-based financing. Here in Silicon Valley, I think we do a wonderful job of getting technologies more advanced through VC dollars. But then how do you take those technologies that have become proven and actually get assets in the ground and have the impact that really needs to happen in the community from a climate change perspective and also other perspectives in infrastructure. So what we do is we invest into companies and then we help them be that first step in asset-based deployment in these smaller communities. Really.
So Lindsay, I'm going to stop you. You mentioned that. You mentioned asset-based financing twice.
Yes.
Define it for the audience, just in case there's two people sitting here who don't
Thank
know.
you. I probably should have stopped there.
I want you to keep going, but help us understand what that means and why it's unique.
Of course. Asset-based financing. So think about how does an asset actually get financed?
What's an asset?
So an asset could be a bridge, it could be a broadband project, it could be a microgrid. Right now those assets in a
I thought venture capital is financing it.
Not typically though, some dabble in it, but typically a venture capitalist is just investing into a company to help it grow from stage to stage.
Okay.
But then if you think about actually deploying assets, so a bridge, a broadband asset, a microgrid, typically those assets are financed on balance sheet by a utility, by a public sector entity, traditionally all up front. Occasionally they look at things over time. But providing that alternative financing mechanism where we'll invest equity, occasionally raise debt over the long term on a performance-based contracting style to help these counterparties get a better performance-based contracting mechanism, but also not always have to pay for everything all up front.
Wait a minute, that's unique, right? I can't think of any VC fund that does that, or am I mistaken?
Yeah, it's not super common around here. That's true. So yes, what we are doing is bridging that gap between VC and private equity in the sense that the companies that we invest in, we offer that optionality to go to end clients and open up the suite of financing mechanisms as they go to these smaller communities.
So that's another big idea for underserved communities.
Absolutely. In these underserved communities, the asset sizes are typically smaller. It's one of the reasons why they've been underserved, but amongst many others. But smaller asset sizes makes it harder to write checks because
do you think investors and you can make money as you make money in this? Is it big enough to be profitable?
Yeah, absolutely. We invest at the intersection of mission as well as profit. We deploy infrastructure with the belief to give access, but also drive socioeconomic change. But we also do it where we can make profit for our investors.
Got it. Well, all right, I'm going to go back because I want to ask you some more. But Sherman, your turn now. So tell me about dual use investing. And again, why, how, why is it a good idea?
Well,
why isn't the government just doing this? Why does private capital?
Yeah, so the government is not positioned. That organization is not aligned to invest in things. As a matter of fact, the United States government cannot take equity stakes in companies by law, right? And domestically. Some rules have changed internationally. The government realizes it cannot create technology itself, so it relies on private sector and has done so for many years, right? Right now is the absolute best time. It's funny because she's doing infrastructure, I'm doing dual use tech. This is the best time, I would say, in a very long time to invest in our theses. I use this as the example.
You're going to invest in each other? Is that
I would. Let's do it. Well, because the amount of money that has been passed by the United States government to basically effectively kind of create an industry, right? A lot of industries, we say we're laissez-faire free market capitalists, but we're not. I mean, the government does kind of fuel a lot of industries. You mentioned the situation with Spacex and Starlink. Well, everyone needs to realize it took Elon 4 tries to get that rocket off the ground. September 26, 2008 is when he did it. He put his house up he had to give a personal guarantee to get that off the ground. And he was gonna shut down things. In December of 2008, NASA gave him a contract for additional launches. So we all pay for that, the US citizens in the room, right? What you're seeing is the government realizes that you have to incentivize, subsidize. Another example, Tesla, $450 million loan from the government, same time as Solyndra. Solyndra failed. A lot of people bring that up, but they don't realize Tesla also got money. They went public in order to pay back that loan, right? So the government is subsidizing these technologies that will eventually disrupt things sometime down the line.
You think your fund has a silent partner, not so silent, that's actually going to be a force multiplier for your fund?
Yes, you have to, but you have to understand where the money is going in the government. But the trick is you cannot rely on government contracts. The government acquisition system is not well functioning.
So this is the dual part of dual use.
Exactly.
And what does that mean?
So what that means is, effectively, you have to find companies that are able to source non-dilutive funding from the government. They're early in their product development. Find those companies that can source the non-dilutive funding from the government, which lowers the cost of capital for those companies to commercialize. But then you have to find the entrepreneur that's mainly focused on commercialization. If you get lost in what I call the valley of death, where you're going after that government contract and administration changes, the acquisition officer changes, then you're going to be in a bad place.
And so that's the dual and dual
That's
use.
the dual and dual
Just get
use.
free government money to start and then commercialize it, then sell it back to the government as well.
You can sell it back to the government, but you definitely sell it back to the government. Yeah. You're really going to have value creation truly by selling commercially.
And what are some specific examples your fund is thinking about in this area?
So we are focused on deep tech. The intersection of dual use and deep tech is pretty broad. So we're focused on some areas that we know best. So I spent many years as a life sciences investment banker. So health tech is one of the areas. The VA, Veterans Administration hospital system, is the largest in the United States. Also, the VA trains more healthcare professionals than any other in the United States. We're also focused on space tech. I've been the VC in residence with NASA and JPL, and now the US Space Force for the TechStar Space Tech program for years. And sustainability tech is another area. It's something that me and my co-founder were simply passionate about. And we developed this thesis well before all this money came down the pipe. So it's feeling pretty good right now.
And you mentioned deep tech. What's your definition of deep tech for your fund and in general?
So deep tech, the definition is companies that are building technologies that are out of the R&D phase, but those technologies do not yet have wide-scale commercial adoption. And the litmus test for us is whether or not those technologies can either disrupt an existing market or create a brand new market.
And you think this dual-use model allows you to find companies that are disruptive and can scale at the same time?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Yeah. Kind of exciting. So one more round, and then we'll open it to the audience. Lindsay, how do you think about ESG and impact as it pertains to infrastructure? I mean, is there a fit?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's absolutely there's a fit. Infrastructure has really served as what I would call the backbone of our societies, that foundation upon which our societies have been meant to function and really grow and thrive. And so through the investment in infrastructure assets, you can really drive socioeconomic change in communities. What we do as we invest in infrastructure is we look at the holistic approach of what these things can do for the community. For example, when you deploy broadband to a rural community, it's very possible that many of the people in these communities might have not had proper access to broadband before. So how can you teach someone to use broadband to actually drive that true socioeconomic change in a community beyond just the access to the infrastructure? So really thinking about things holistically like that, not just for broadband, but also for when you're investing in energy assets, for example. Can you quantify the actual impact on carbon emissions, for example, as you really make these investments? And that's something we do holistically, but it's something that infrastructure really can be an enabler for society from a mission and sustainability perspective.
Well, thank you. Sherman, any last comments before we open it up to the audience?
I would say that it's just, the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act just passed, like in the last, 4 or 5 weeks. I would just, heavily pay attention to that. provisions in those bills both support both of our theses. There are a lot of outstanding entrepreneurs that are coming up. There are a lot of emerging managers that are trying to back these companies, and these companies trying to put out these technologies. I would just really pay attention to that. Yeah.
I think both of you are pointing out something I think this audience has probably been hearing for the last 2 days, is that these technologies are changing not only the tech, but are changing the business models of both funds and the companies themselves that you're going to invest in. I think we're going to see some exciting changes. So questions from the audience? You have the mic.
Maybe. There we go. I have a question for each of you. Thank you both. That was really terrific. And Steve, that was an array of great questions. But Lindsay, from your perspective, in this ability for the underserved community to participate, can you describe how specifically that happens? Is that through some crowdfunding, or how are you bypassing accredited investor issues? And what's the path if that happens? And for Sherman, maybe an example of the actual maneuvering from government to commercial would be really helpful. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sure. On that first question, in terms of, how do we get communities to be engaged and participate? There are ways where we get partnerships involved, whether it's a university, whether it's a community, whether it's the individual residents, being able to, it could be a pooling, as you're mentioning, investing into the asset themselves or investing into the company that we're talking about, but also looking at, as you get to meeting return thresholds, can you actually reinvest back into the community the money that you're making, so that you're really driving additional initiatives beyond just what you're investing in initially.
And then for me, as far as navigating, there's NSF, there's NIH, and then of course there's DoD. So you have the SBIR program and the STTR program, where companies are able to source non-dilutive funding. Something happened in 2018 where, there's been matching, I did my research, there's been matching for some years, but certain elements of particularly DoD, because non-dilutive funding is based on how big the budget is, right? The Department of Defense has the biggest budget in the United States government, and part of the discretionary budget, right? It's over 50, almost 50%. And they dramatically increased the amount of matching funding. So what happens is DoD tells a company, you need to go out, we're willing to give you, let's say $15 million, but you have to go out and find $15 million. You have to convince Lindsay and Sherman to also give you $15 million. Of course, our underwriting, because we have to return that money back to our LPs, and we want to make money also. Our underwriting is a little bit different from the government. It's been a pretty good process. So I like to say for these companies, they should seek to source that non-dilutive funding from the government, right? And then we as investors will assess whether or not that company actually has the ability to scale commercially.
Can you give an example of the company, if you can disclose one, just a company through the process, and do it without any acronyms?
Yeah, absolutely. That's tough for a military guy.
You and Walsh.
Yeah, so a lot of people use the classic case. I hate to use the defense case, but a lot of people use the classic case of Anduril, right? But I hate to use defense tech because we don't only invest in defense tech at AIN. But what companies like that do is they go out and get SBIR funding, Small Business Innovation Research Grant funding. It's staged out in 3 phases. So the phase 1 is you get money for just a white paper. Phase 2, it's about $50,000. Phase 2, you get about $750,000, okay? And in phase 3, it's unlimited as far as how much money you can get. Now, there are other sub-programs within that SBIR funding process, and at phase 2 and phase 3, you can actually get more money than $750K, and of course, phase 3 is unlimited, but they will say you have to go get matching funding dollar for dollar from a private investor, because the government does not want you solely surviving off the back of of it, right? It wants you to be commercially viable so they can, potentially use you in the future. Because if they don't give you a contract, then you would die and they wouldn't have access to that technology.
So this is what happens at Stanford late in the afternoon. Sherman, I'm going to do something to Lindsay and Steve. I hope it's going to be okay. You know about IRAD money, Independent Research and Development money, which is free venture capital that the government gives to defense contractors that they must spend, but the government cannot tell them how to spend. Lindsay, with all the federal funding of infrastructure, which is humongous, couldn't there be an IRAD, Independent Research and Development, little slot that they say to people such as your fund, find a way to deploy this so that the community that is rural, by the old economy definition, becomes engaged in updating what its economic model should be in the future? I mean, we could borrow this, I call it free venture capital money concept from the prime contractor world and throw it into the infrastructure world that you're dealing with. I mean, could you folks please talk about this? And it's a lot of money, Lindsay, that you could deploy.
I mean, I like the idea.
Where do you sign?
Yeah, we should put something together so that we can do it. But I mean, in all honesty, there's a lot of money out there right now, both from the initial infrastructure package and the new inflation bill. There's obviously, what you just mentioned right now. I think there, are a lot of challenges right now with figuring out the right ways to deploy that capital efficiently and effectively, which is critical. So if we tap into something like that, that's above and beyond what there already is out there, which needs, I think, a little bit more efficient processes.
I think the issue there is that the defense contractors have such a long-standing relationship with the government. They have people in Congress, et cetera. So they're able to set up organizations so they can get that money. For an infrastructure bill, it is promising in the sense that the infrastructure bill has ARPA-I that passed back in November of last year. So imagine like a DARPA, but for infrastructure. And there's also ARPA-E right now. So with respect to infrastructure, there are not necessarily that many folks that have the long-standing relationship with the government like the defense primes. But hopefully, those folks will develop, and I think it's about a lot of folks, like people in this room, who, when they do have conversations with certain people, in Congress, et cetera, it's to ensure that some of the things that the Defense Department gets, that you also get that with respect to DOE, you get that with respect to infrastructure, et cetera.
Great. Thank you very much. We really
guys.
appreciate it.